Welcome to this revision video by the English department. Today we're going to be doing a short parent's guide to Macbeth. Macbeth appears in the English literature exam on paper 1. The paper is 1 hour 45 minutes long. It is the same exam as The Sign of Four, which is our 19th century novel, and it's currently scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 15th of May 2019. In the exam, students will be given an extract from Macbeth. They'll be told which part of the play it comes from, and they'll be asked to respond to a question. They have to demonstrate a knowledge of the extract, so they should show that they know what's going on, where it appears in the play, that they understand what's happened before and afterwards. A knowledge of the wider text, so they should be able to see something in the extract and make a link to the wider play. An understanding of language and structure, so they have to zoom in on key words, zoom in on key structural features, and comment on how the writer wanted their reader, or their audience in this case, to respond. And they have to show an understanding of context, so the history behind the play, what was going on at the time, ideas that come through in the play, so why the writer wrote it, what message they're trying to send, and perspectives, how different people might respond to this play, what feelings it might evoke in them. So Macbeth is a play, which means it's designed to be performed for a live audience. It was written in 1606, which makes it one of Shakespeare's later plays. So by this point, he was writing plays that were commissioned by royalty, and this play in particular would have been performed in front of King James at the time. It takes inspiration from some key historical events that were going on. The most famous one is the Gunpowder Plot, that we now celebrate Firework Night for. That had just happened, and in this play we see the murder of a king, and obviously the Gunpowder Plot was the attempted murder of a king. It's also a time when a fear of witches and the supernatural in general was quite prevalent in society, and there were a number of people being tried and executed for being witches. We also had a Scottish king on the throne, and this play is a Scottish play set in Scotland, and obviously all our characters are Scottish. The play opens with the witches, which sets this story up to be very mysterious and very evil, and Shakespeare is playing on that fear of witchcraft that people at the time had, and it's something that we as a modern audience wouldn't really understand, but the fear of the supernatural was a real thing, and people were being executed for being witches at this time. So the witches are on stage and they are concocting spells and talking about all the really horrible things that they've done, and one of the really key quotes that they say is "Fair is foul and foul is fair," and we immediately get that idea that something bad is going to happen in this play. We then move to a sergeant describing a battle scene in which we hear about our main character Macbeth, and he is described as brave, and we're told about how he pretty much single-handedly has won this battle, which has meant that the King, Duncan, has been able to retain control of Scotland against the evil rebels that have been trying to overthrow him. When we finally get to meet Macbeth, he is returning from battle with his friend and his fellow soldier Banquo, and as they are walking home, they meet the witches that we have already seen in Act 1. And we get our first description of the witches from Banquo. He tells us that they are wild and they're withered, and we expect them to be dressed in quite a dishevelled way and to look a little bit chaotic. And when Macbeth goes to speak to them, they respond by giving him 3 prophecies. The first prophecy is that they tell him he is the Thane of Glamis. Now, a Thane is a bit like a nobleman, what we might think of a duke or an earl now. Macbeth is already Thane of Glamis, that's his position in society and in the Scottish aristocracy. So he kind of says to them, well, I'm already Thane of Glamis. I was made Thane of Glamis when my father died. And the second witch says to him, and you will become Thane of Cawdor. And Macbeth kind of says, well, no, I won't, because the Thane of Cawdor is alive. And, I can't just take on his job. The third witch then says to him, and Macbeth, you shall be king hereafter, which is the big moment in the play where Macbeth, that seed is planted in Macbeth's mind that he might become the king. Now at this point, Macbeth has no idea that actually the Thane of Cawdor has been found guilty of being a traitor to King Duncan and has already been executed, and that actually people are on their way right now to tell Macbeth he's going to be promoted to be Thane of Cawdor. And when that moment happens, he will obviously believe that the witch's prophecy has come true and may start to think that his chances of being king are therefore increased. Now his friend Banquo is a little bit more sceptical of the witches. He doesn't quite buy into what they're saying, and he describes them as instruments of darkness, meaning that they might be just playing with Macbeth, trying to manipulate him into doing something he might not otherwise do. Macbeth's first idea, after getting these prophecies and being told that he is indeed going to be promoted to the Thane of Cawdor, is to write a letter home to his wife. And we meet his wife, Lady Macbeth, on stage as she is reading this letter. And it becomes really clear through the words that he uses that he truly loves his wife, that there is real affection in their relationship. He calls her my dearest partner of greatness, which suggests a certain equality in their relationship, something that would be a little bit unusual at this time. You know, it's a society where men do rule, so it would be unusual to have a woman being placed in this kind of position of equality. But he does tell us that they love each other, they care deeply for each other, and that there is a trust between the two of them. Now, Lady Macbeth doesn't quite respond in the way the audience expects. Instead, she calls on spirits to help her and guide her so that she can convince Macbeth that the only way to become king is to actually kill the current king. Now, this would be really shocking for the audience, because the last thing we expect is for this woman to establish a connection between herself and the supernatural so early on. And she asked them to do things such as filling her from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty, basically asking the witches, asking the supernatural to make her evil so that she is capable of doing something really horrible. When Macbeth finally returns home, he tells his wife that King Duncan is on his way to their house and that they're going to have a party and a banquet to celebrate the fact that they've won this battle. And Lady Macbeth immediately starts her work on manipulating her husband into committing this crime, into killing the king. And she tells him to look like the innocent flower, but to be the serpent under it, basically saying you need to look trustworthy, you need to look like you're a good friend to Duncan, but actually underneath we're going to be planning and plotting his death. Now Macbeth isn't quite convinced by this idea. He plays along with it for a little bit. His wife is a very convincing woman. She certainly has a lot of power in this relationship. But after she's left and he's alone on stage, he delivers a soliloquy, which is where we get an insight into a character's mind. And he tells us that he has no real reason to kill Duncan, that he's been a good king and that he's always given him lots of opportunities. But we also learn that Macbeth is an ambitious person. And he describes his ambition as vaulting ambition, the idea that it somehow jumps over all the problems, that his ambition will carry him over any problems that killing the king might cause. So as much as Macbeth wouldn't really choose to kill Duncan, we do get a sense that it's not something he's totally against. At the start of Act 2, we see Macbeth making his way towards Duncan's bedchamber with a dagger in his hand, preparing himself to kill Duncan. And he talks about seeing a dagger of the mind, which is him telling us that he's having visions. He sees the weapon that he's going to use, and it's leading him towards Duncan's bedchamber. We don't actually see Macbeth kill Duncan, it's all done off stage. But when he returns on stage, he's noticeably covered in blood, and we immediately know that this has been a very violent crime. The fact that he's used a dagger implies that it would have been a very violent scene, and Macbeth would be considerably covered in blood. And his reaction is one of shock and one of shame and guilt. And he talks about how the blood will stain him and how there's so much of it. And he questions whether even great Neptune's ocean could wash this blood clean from his hand. His wife, on the other hand, reacts in a slightly different way. And she takes the daggers from him and returns to Duncan's bedchamber, where she plants them on his guards in order to set them up for the death, and in order to make it look like they were the ones that were responsible. So even at this moment where they've done something really bad, Lady Macbeth is taking control and leading the situation. Following the death of Duncan, Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, flee Scotland, and they run away to England to seek safety in King Edward's castle. They do that because they fear for their own lives, but to everybody else it looks like they're guilty. It looks like they had a part in this crime. It's decided that Macbeth should be the next King of Scotland, and we see him crowned on stage, and that final prophecy that the witches delivered coming true. And we start to wonder whether or not the witches were actually magical, or whether they just started an idea that Macbeth and his wife has seen through. Now, at this time, for royalty, it was particularly important to have a child to continue the line. England had already seen lots of civil war because of various queens and kings not having children, and it causes a lot of conflict and friction because people have to decide who's going to take over. And Macbeth becomes quite obsessed with needing to have a child, and unfortunately the Macbeths don't. They seem unable to have a child, and he describes how the witches have upon his head placed a fruitless crown and put a barren sceptre in my gripe, the crown and the sceptre being those symbols of royalty, but barren and fruitless implying that the line that Macbeth's reign as king will end with him, that he will not be fortunate enough to have a child himself. Macbeth starts to become very concerned about his friend Banquo, the only other person in this play who actually knows the truth and knows about the witches' prophecies. Banquo's also got a son, which evokes feelings of jealousy in Macbeth. He feels that Banquo has more chance of continuing a legacy by having a child. And Macbeth decides to have Banquo killed, that it's too risky to let him stay alive. So he sends and commissions 2 men to kill Banquo for him. Now as king, he can't be seen to do those things himself. After committing that crime, Macbeth throws a big banquet and makes a big show of him being king, and also makes a big show of inviting Banquo to this, and tells everyone that he's really disappointed that Banquo couldn't attend, obviously not telling them that he's responsible for Banquo's death. During this banquet, Macbeth sees the ghost of his friend. He sees the ghost of Banquo, and he is covered in blood. And obviously this frightens Macbeth tremendously, and he has a really emotional reaction, and Lady Macbeth has to try and cover for him. And one thing that Macbeth says is that blood will have blood, and it's as if he's had this realization that the crimes he's committed may and will come back to haunt him, and that what he's done he is not going to get away with. In the final act of the play, in Act 5, we see Lady Macbeth sleepwalking. Now, at this time, it was believed sleepwalking was almost a mental illness. It's something that people did because their minds were unstable. And throughout this play, we've been given lots of reasons why Lady Macbeth might lose control of her mind. She's been part of the plot to kill the king. She knows that her husband has killed his best friend, but her husband also along the way has killed lots of other people, including the wife and children of one of his rivals. And it is another murder that we don't see on stage, but we hear about. And it's almost as if this killing spree that they've gone on sends Lady Macbeth into madness, and we see her sleepwalking on stage, carrying a candle and appearing to need to wash her hands constantly. She keeps repeating the phrase, out damned spot, and she's seeing blood on her hands, blood that isn't actually there, but that she believes is there. And we're left to kind of wonder whether or not this is all in her mind and she can actually still see blood on her hands, or whether it's a sign of her guilt and that she feels like she has to try and wash it away and she's not doing it very successfully. This is the last time that we see Lady Macbeth on stage, before we're told that she has died. There's a hint that she's taken her own life, although we don't see anything like that explicitly. It's just a suggestion from one of the other characters. In the final scenes of the play, Macbeth, now alone, having lost his wife, lost his best friend, and lost his king, fears and knows that the end is coming. But he still has this perception of himself as being protected by the supernatural. He still sees himself to be a little invincible, despite armies now approaching Scotland in order to claim their country back. He is faced by the man whose wife and children he killed by Macduff, who is adamant that he is going to be the one to get revenge on Macbeth. He calls him a tyrant, he calls him a coward, and he calls him a hellhound, all really big insults at this time, particularly for someone who, at the start of the play, this Macbeth was a good guy. He was a really good warrior, a good soldier. And so for him to be called a coward and a tyrant now is really quite a seismic fall from grace. He responds to Macbeth by saying, Macduff by saying, I will not yield, meaning that he is not going to surrender to Macduff. He's going to go down fighting. So we see that little hint of nobility left in Macbeth, but ultimately he has to pay for the crimes that he has committed. Macduff and Macbeth leave stage fighting. And again, we don't see characters die on stage in this play, but when Macduff returns to the stage carrying Macbeth's head, we are left in no doubt that he has indeed killed our main character. Peace is restored in Scotland when the son of Duncan is crowned and everything kind of returns back to normalcy. He says that he's going to reward people who were loyal to him, and he also makes reference to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, calling them the dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. So that idea of Macbeth killing and slaughtering people, and Lady Macbeth being evil and manipulative. And that's how our play ends. Macbeth itself is a story that's very violent and very dark, but it also is incredibly interesting. Lots and lots of modern stories play on some of the similar ideas of murder and power and ambition and the things people are willing to do in order to get the thing that they most crave, in order to get to the point that they most desire, such as Macbeth wanting to be king. Your child in the exam does need to know quotations from the play. It's a closed book exam, which means they can't take anything into the play with them. So one way that you can help your child to revise for Macbeth is to ask them about key quotations, such as some of the ones you've seen in this video. You could maybe tell them about a quotation you've heard and ask them to talk to you about it, to tell you perhaps which part of the play it's from or what's happening at the time when it's said. You might also like to play a game where you start the quotation and they have to finish it. Or you could discuss the plot with them and ask them what happens next or what happened before key moments in the play. Either way, any conversation that you can have with your child about the play is going to help them just with that memory and with developing that knowledge that they need in order to be really successful in the exam. As always, if you've got any questions or if you've got any suggestions of other videos that you'd like us to make, please don't hesitate to contact us at the school. Thanks very much for listening.